So we have Dr. Norman Paradis, founder and CEO of CPR Therapeutics. Norman, go ahead and share your screen. We look forward to hearing all about an innovation in CPR, which my understanding is something like this hasn't come along for a very, very long time.
Well, thank you, Katie. Thank you very much. I'm honored to be presenting to such a renowned angel group. Michael and Katie didn't want me to do this, but I'm going to thank them anyway. They've given me some excellent coaching in the last day or two. This is a healthcare audience, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time dwelling on the fact that sudden cardiac arrest is the leading killer in Western countries, and that unlike on television, the outcomes are generally poor with survival less than 10%. I would like to highlight just a single factoid, which is that a 10% improvement in the outcomes of patients suffering sudden death would save more lives than any single agent in oncology. The reason for the bad outcomes is well known. If you look to the left, you'll see that the blood flows with ideal CPR, this is laboratory CPR, are only a fraction of normal. When EMS personnel are doing manual in the field, their flows are even less than this. The two current most commonly used devices, the auto pulse from Zoll and the Lucas from Stryker, do not have better blood flows than manual, and they both failed their clinical trials. Potential solution has been obvious for some time. If you look to the left, you can see that greater force and greater depth of CPR is associated with better outcomes. But there's no way to achieve that with the current approaches. If you look to the right, you see the skeletal fractures and visceral organ injuries from manual CPR, the auto pulse, and the Lucas. They're already in the range of 60 to 80% of all patients. If you tried to put in more force, you would just do tremendous damage. Almost 30 years ago, we spent $16 million of the NIH funds developing Circumferential Vest Cpr. That's the blue band you're seeing in this image. This approach, by spreading the force around the chest, allows us to double or triple the amount of motive force without doing any damage. Unfortunately, 20 or 30 years ago, the state of pneumatics and batteries were such that the device did not get commercialized. We continue to enhance it by adding abdominal counterpulsation in green, sternal selective in red, and the synchronization of the electrical therapies, which you can't see in this image. As you heard in a little bit of video earlier, a picture's worth 1,000 words. If you look to the left, you can see the blood flows in a pig model of cardiac arrest. The yellow is CPR-T multimodal CPR, and the other bars are pig equivalents of the auto pulse, the Lucas, and manual. These numbers looked almost too good to be true, so I've included on the right actual raw data out of the pig model, and you probably don't need me to point out the segments of multimodal CPR. The blood flows are dramatically better. In reviewing our history, it's a bit longer than most startups. If you look, you'll see the 16 million in NIH funding in the 90s, and then the failure of that company because of the pneumatics and the battery. You then see our continuing innovation in multimodal CPR. And I want to highlight one or two other things, which is that the startup was started with a seed grant from Zoll Medical, the premier strategic in this space, and then $350,000 in angel funds. We have a very strong IP position, We filed multiple patents on multimodal CPR and all its combinations. Of particular importance for some investors, and so I'd like to highlight it, is that we're going to do a staged 510K series to get to multimodal. And the first step is a 510K of just the old vest as a cath lab device. We plan to do that in the next 15 months so that the company goes from developmental to commercial relatively quickly. Here is our team. Briefly, everyone in the field of resuscitation medicine knew that because of our first mover advantage and all of the patents, we were going to have the only opportunity at better CPR in this decade. And so we had our pick of founders. And I personally think this is the team that you would have put together if you could choose anyone. Again, thank you for the opportunity, Michael and Katie. I'm really appreciative and look forward to any questions.
Great. For those of you that are in our audience, please put any questions you have for Norman and CPR Therapeutics in the Q&A. That's just to the right of the chat if you haven't been on this AirMeet platform before. But I'm going to start with a couple of my own questions. If we think about your timeline or just in looking at your timeline, it looks like this technology has been around for a while. So why has it taken so long to get to market?
Yeah, Katie, that's a great question. This was the first device that Johns Hopkins ever out-licensed. And when you license something out, you kind of give up your baby a little bit. And we didn't necessarily agree that the state of pneumatics and batteries was so poor in 1990 that it wasn't worth proceeding to commercializations, but the investors at the time did. And so they stopped proceeding.
Very good. And one of my just a clinical question, how hard is this to apply during an emergency? I mean, if this is really circumferential on the patient, it seems like it might be difficult when, of course, you're stressed and trying to move quickly.
Yeah, another really good question. There's no avoiding the fact that a device will always involve some interruption. Even though the CPR-T device is multimodal and has a lot of high tech in it, to the providers, it looks like a giant blood pressure cuff. So you put it next to the patient, lift them up and roll them on, and then close it. In simulations in the lab, people with just a bit of training can uniformly put it on in under 20 seconds. And it's so simple that we actually think someday down the road, an airport AED-like version could be developed for health clubs and things. It goes on as easily as a device can go on. Nothing will ever beat hands. We won't beat that for time. We'll just beat it for blood flows.
Great. And actually that leads into one of our audience questions. Talk a little bit more about your go-to-market strategy and distribution plan. And specifically, Dr. Rothstein asked, what is the plan for pre-hospital distribution of this device?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Rothstein. To get into EMS, you are going to have to get a level 1 recommendation from the American Heart predicated on a definitive clinical trial. So we know we're 36 to 48 months away from that. And that's the reason we're going to go first with the in-hospital vest application as a way to market. We've actually gotten pull out of interventional cardiology because the current devices interfere with imaging. And so every time there's a cardiac arrest in the cath lab, it's kind of a cluster where someone has to get up on the table and do CPR in the beam because the current devices interfere. The vest is completely radiolucent, so that's our pathway to commercialization in the near term.
Very good. And talk another clinically relevant question. We saw you talk about the failure of some of these competitors out there and the amazing data, at least in your pig studies, which is awesome. But tell us why your device doesn't cause the thoracic damage but it's able to provide sufficient force.
Yeah, I get asked that question a lot. And so I've come up with a little analogy about circumferential. If you take an egg and try and break it by squeezing it evenly all around, it's much more difficult. And so circumferential is analogous to trying to break an egg by squeezing it everywhere.
Very good. All right. One last question for you tonight. Can you talk a little bit more about your planned in-human studies? Because I would imagine if your device really can do what it says it can do, comparing it to standard of care is probably not what we would want to be doing.
Yeah, so we're hopeful in the near term, Katie. We took the vest all the way to a New England Journal paper in the 90s with about 70 or 80 patients. So we think that because it's intrinsically safer and at least equally effective, we think that the FDA will give us a 510(k) clearance either with no additional clinical data or just an early feasibility study in 15 or 20 patients. That's the good news. The bad news is that, and the bad news has a flip side to it, which is that eventually you have to do an RTC. You have to do it under exemption from consent, and you have to improve outcomes.
Right.
Now, what I like to tell people is that's a lot of pain. But if you think about it, a device that improves outcome in that setting isn't a discretionary purchase in emergency medicine or EMS. So there is a reward for all of that difficulty, but I don't want to say that it's going to be an easy road for us.
Yeah, I think this is going to be the must-have device for every EMS, emergency room, hospital, etc. I said last question, but I think there's a fairly easy one that came from our audience as well. Do you have information on how much this costs? How much is the device going to cost?
Yeah, we spent a fair amount of time talking to EMS and emergency physicians about this, and we know from the engineers what the cost of goods sold will be. The two current devices sell for about $17,000. We think we can get this device into the hands of clinicians for something like $22,000 to $24,000.
All right. Well, Norman, thank you so much for being here tonight. This is really exciting. I mean, clearly, if we can save more lives using CPR, we want to do it, right?
Thanks, Katie. And again, thanks for the coaching the last few days.
You're very welcome. We're happy to have you.